Before his untimely passing, Kentaro Miura would say that Berserk's story was 1,000 years old. And the biggest reasons for that claim were these two guys. Two dudes that are iconic for their skeletal features. Skull Knight and Void's story is kind of a catalyst for everything that happens in Berserk. The rivalry shared by Guts and Griffith is a direct parallel of their own, and perhaps with good reason. Like Void, Griffith chooses to discard his mortal shell and become something far greater, a God Hand. Like Skull Knight, Guts struggles against the God Hand, cutting a bloody path through the endless night. Both of them are equally dangerous for their respective enemies, and both are as enigmatic as the other. But one thing that is clear is their hatred for each other, even if it was made evident only for a mere instant. So that brings us to the question we posed in the title of this video: how will their story end? And who will win? Let's find out. What happened 1,000 years ago? The basis for the rivalry between Skull Knight and Void. To understand why Miura called his story a 1,000-year-old tale, we have to understand what happened 1,000 years ago. And to understand that, we have to talk about Chapter 362, and a couple of other things as well. People who have been supporting this channel since day one will know that we think Skull Knight is the tortured soul of Supreme King Geiserik, galloping around in a skeleton armor fashioned by his good friend Hanar. If you're new here, we'll give you guys a quick rundown of the long list of hints. Number 1. Charlotte's story about King Geiserik from Chapter 53 reminds Guts of Skull Knight and takes place 1,000 years ago. Number 2. Multiple characters from the series call Skull Knight Your Majesty, which wouldn't make sense unless he was a king at some point. And Number 3. The Berserker armor's helm, before Guts puts it on, is in the shape of a skull, which is perhaps the biggest clue that Geiserik had an evil reputation, in part because he was the last Berserker. The Berserker armor draws its design from the inner malice of its owner, after all, which is why it changed to closely resemble Guts' Beast of Darkness when he inherited it. The hints that Void is also a 1,000-year-old entity are fewer, but they're definitely there. For starters, there's Mozgus' story about the sage that Geiserik tortured in the Tower of Conviction. Mozgus claims that Geiserik tortured the guy so bad, an angel descended to give him deliverance from his pain personally. Any person connected to Midland's past can automatically be assumed to be a part of Geiserik's as well, and Void does talk in rather preacher-like fashion. Then, there's the more subtle detail of the God Hand cycle of creation only being repeated once every 216 years. If we backtrack from Griffith's ascension, we land roughly around the 1,000-year mark, which is also when Geiserik's empire fell. And finally, we have Chapter 362, which practically confirms that becoming Void was that sage's revenge on the man that becomes Skull Knight. The entire chapter is focused on a blood memory of the previous wearer of the armor, aka Skull Knight, and Guts' experience of the same. In it, you can see that in the final moments of his life, Skull Knight was being confronted by Void, as the abyss swirled in the background. You can learn more about this in detail in our How Did Supreme King Geiserik's Empire Fall video. It's got a lot of lore connections we can't get into in too much detail here, but this is the point where it all began. So let's talk about it a little bit more. Skull Knight vs. Void. Round 1. Vengeance, Destruction, and Pain. Let's talk about the final moments of the human life of Skull Knight and try to understand how it snowballed into his inhuman life. We know from the fairy tale of the Skull King that at some point King Geiserik gave into his hubris and essentially broke bad. Fun fact, but the Kingdom of Midland we know today was actually just the capital city of Geiserik's continental empire, and we want you to think about that for a minute. The Tower of Conviction and the Tower of Rebirth were in the same city, which makes a lot more sense when you think of it that way. Skull Knight was feeling himself a bit too much, and he ended up amassing haters by the hundreds, chief of which was Void, pre-face skewering. The virtuous sage was imprisoned for calling out Geiserik's excesses. He was tormented to the point where his bones are more visible than his flesh, and whatever flesh we do see is pulled apart in gut-wrenching ways. Skull Knight didn't reach the summit of mankind all by himself, he had people with him who helped him reach that peak, chief of which must have been the Elfhelm mages like Gedfring and Flora. His lover in that lifetime was the Lady Priestess of Cherry Blossoms, an immensely powerful sorceress whose talents eclipsed Flora's own. She was likely his queen as well, because when we see her in the blood memory, she has a crown. But we don't know if she knew about her husband's favorite pastime of casual torture or not, because most others that remember Skull Knight speak of him in fond remembrance. He could have devolved into degeneracy because of the effects of the Berserker armor, but that doesn't excuse the fate both of them ended up experiencing. After Sage Void had reached a certain threshold of desperation, despair, and desire, his denunciation of Geiseric's ways and cries for salvation were answered by the idea of evil, which turned him into the first God-Hand member. As part of his ascension, Void must have decided to sacrifice everyone in Geiseric's capital city, because not only do we see the Lady Priestess with a brand of sacrifice on her arm in that flashback sequence, we also see multiple corpses with the brand seared onto their foreheads, lying underneath the Tower of Rebirth, courtesy of Chapter 53. Once he gained the power of evil, he summoned an interstice which swallowed Geiseric's capital and sealed it underneath Wyndham. That's not to say King G didn't put up a fight first. In fact, that's what Chapter 362 is all about. In the final moments of his human life, Skull Knight was fighting against a tide of apostle-like creatures in the middle of what appeared to be city blocks, covered in demonic-looking tentacles. Since he was the owner of the Berserker armor at this point, killing monsters was nothing to him. He slashes through what appears to be dozens of demon spawns, emerging from the space between those tentacles in what is one of the coolest full-page spreads from the entire series. If it were just evil astral creatures, Skull Knight could have probably died without regret in his heart. But turns out, he was trying to protect his woman at the same time. She dies in his arms as a massive brand of sacrifice appears on the grounds of his capital city, and the Skull King finally comes face to face with Void. That fairy tale we mentioned earlier talks about how, after Geiseric's hedonistic tendencies reached their breaking point, God himself sent forth angels to destroy his city, but the number is often disputed. Many think there were 4 angels, and more think that there were 5. Chapter 362 confirms that the number was most likely 5, and the confusion arose because Void was created right before the downfall of Geiseric's empire. Who those other 4 creatures were, we don't know. It's possible that they're part of an older version of the God Hand, or the 4 kings of the world. Either answer is as good as the other right now, since we have no updates on their identity. But what we do know is that Skull Knight breathes his final breath while facing these entities. When Shirke gets the Berserker armor to Guts, she wonders why her mistress wants him to use such a dangerous fetish because, number 1, she knows how it works, and if you don't, you should check out our Berserker armor anatomy video, and more importantly, number 2, she knows what happened to the last guy who wore that armor. Skull Knight died donning the Berserker armor, likely trying to reach Void for the pain he caused, but clearly failing in the end. This is backed up by Guts' encounters with Griffith post-incarnation, because while he is the owner of the world's most dangerous weapon, it becomes completely useless in the face of an incarnated God Hand. To put it simply, the Berserker armor was not enough for Skull Knight to stand up to Void in those final moments. Partly because of the way it works, but mainly because Geiseric at that point probably had no clue what a God Hand even was. Even if he did, figuring out their fighting techniques mid-battle was not an option for him for obvious reasons. So, just because of the simple fact that Void went on to become the puppet master of all demon kind, and Skull Knight actually died trying to fight him, we gotta give round 1 to Void. He took out an entire nation's worth of people and his greatest enemy with one move, while Geiseric could only defeat a bunch of monsters, not even a battalion's worth in numbers. Turns out, he's not called the Archangel of Demon Kind for no reason. But if he thought his woes were over, he was sorely mistaken because... Skull Knight vs. Void, round 2. A pot shot for old time's sake. Instead of dying or ending up in the abyss like any normal victim of a demonic ritual in Berserk, Skull Knight became the first survivor of such an ordeal, sort of. Instead of passing away, his vengeful spirit, now driven solely by the desire to kill all inhumans, was imbued within an armor created by Hanar so he could carry out his revenge quest. The man Geiseric became the Wraith Skull Knight, and ever since that fateful day 1,000 years ago, he's been chasing down one man and his empire of lies. Void. While SK generally abhors anyone who sides with the God Hand, pseudo-apostles included, he is also clearly fixated on getting Void first. This is proven in the encounter we'll address in this section, but we wanted to explain a few things first. If Skull Knight was a lethal warrior in his Berserker days, he has now become a one-man demon-slaying corps. In just his brief encounter with the Apostles attacking Rickart's camp in Chapter 52, we see him frighten off unkillable monsters like they were annoying gnats, and then chop them up during the eclipse like tuna for sushi. He's equipped with a magical steed that can not only travel at lightning-fast speeds, but it can also climb trees and, as far as we can tell, fly temporarily, although that could just be a speed thing. Being an astral creature, he only manifests within the physical world upon major temporal junction events, like a demonic ritual, or when the barriers between the physical and astral worlds overlap, like on nights of the full moon. But that hasn't stopped him from making himself the nightmare of every apostle across every century of the God Hand's existence. His skills have become far sharper than in his human life. he no longer has to worry about things like dying, and most of all, his knowledge of the astral world has become so deep that he has come full circle, and now views his human life as having been nothing more than the folly of a fool king. Skull Knight understands and can sense the flow of causality, to the point he can predict where his presence is required next, years in advance. He has traversed the ages, slaughtering countless inhuman foes in his pursuit of Void. Therefore, it speaks volumes to the latter's strength that so far, a guy as strong as Skull Knight has been unable to even put a dent in his exposed brain, let alone crack it open. Skull Knight is powerful enough to hang with Zod for 300 years. He's powerful enough to break into interstices and alter the flow of temporal junction events, even if it is marginal. What he still can't seem to do is get the God Hand itself, because over time they have only multiplied, while Skull Knight continues to struggle against Fate's tide. When he started his revenge quest, there was only one demonic angel, now there are 5, and he cannot even get to them without pulling some major crap. And even when he does, they always seem to get the better of him, no matter the situation or causal foreshadowing. When Slann forcefully manifested herself in Qliphoth, she teased SK at his inability to stop the God Hand, and even though Guts injured her partial manifestation, she simply disintegrated her form and left the entire region in chaos. Skull Knight once tried and failed to jump Griffith in his femto state. We'll talk about that in just a bit. But nothing stings more than the utterly dismissive fashion in which Void handled their brief on-panel face-off. In Chapter 88, when Skull Knight broke into Griffith's Eclipse site, he wanted to get Guts and Casca to get out of there immediately, but he couldn't resist taking a potshot at Void, his true immortal enemy. SK blitzes exposed mind with a sword stab, but Void deflects it back at him, not with a shield or anything, but by distorting space itself. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, Void literally deflected Skull Knight's sword back at him. No sooner had SK unleashed his move that Void opened up a portal that sent the tip of the sword back at its original sender. Skull Knight, being Skull Knight, blocked it, of course, and they briefly locked eyes with each other before he went about his actual mission. But that brief exchange was enough to let him know conventional tactics weren't going to cut it against this guy. Void is one of the most enigmatic characters in the series for a reason. Even though other God Hand members openly claim that they are nigh omniscient and not all-knowing, Void's expression, or lack thereof, suggests otherwise. When Guts tried attacking Femto in the Black Swordsman arc and was pushed back by his own spatial powers, everyone else was surprised at the boy's inhuman grit, except Void. Even when Skull Knight escaped with what were technically sacrificial offerings to him, his compeers relished witnessing an unforeseen act. But the focus on Void made it seem like he had long foreseen this occurring. If he knows everything that's coming and can manipulate space itself to aid him, then killing him via stabbing becomes nothing but a pipe dream. Void might not fight as much as Skull Knight, but if he knows the details of an upcoming clash years in advance, all he has to do is prepare for that, really. Even if Void's reaction to SK was completely intuitive, it still doesn't change the fact that you can't touch him within his own domain. And with such OP abilities, we have to wonder if Skull Knight will ever be able to defeat the God Hand decisively. Luckily, he seems to have given the same topic quite a bit of thought as well, and he has come up with a rather novel solution, though its success rate remains to be determined. Skull Knight vs. Void, Round 3. Who will win in the end, and who will die? Like we just told you guys, Skull Knight's track record against the God Hand is dubious at best and pointless at worst, because he's trying to kill a Hydra without burning off its stumps. The number of enemies he needs to take down has grown exponentially in his millennium-long crusade, and after experiencing the reality-warping powers of the God Hand, Skull Knight becomes aware of his own limitations. While he has immense physical strength and speed, he has no way to kill such profound astral creatures, so he decides to create his own with the Sword of Behelitz. You can find out more on this from our Sword of Actuation Anatomy video, but the gist of it is, Skull Knight hasn't just been killing apostles all his life, he's also been collecting the Behelits of fallen apostles and refining them within himself, so that he can one day harness their powers when the moment calls for it. A Behelit, when used, links the luminous body of its owner to the Abyss, turning them into apostles with its powers should they accept such a fate. So Skull Knight basically reverse engineers the whole thing. His Sword of Actuation can perform slashes that cut through the fabric of space itself, banishing whoever's unlucky enough to get trapped in its range straight to the Abyss. When Slann disintegrates in Qliphoth and leaves the realm in cosmic chaos, Skull Knight sends all the evil creatures about to swallow him and Guts whole back into the Abyss with his sword. The God Hand member herself had fled the scene by then, so he didn't get a chance to test it out for its intended purpose, but Skull Knight took being able to rescue Guts as proof that his concepts worked. He was able to do this by taking the Black Swordsman through a dimensional portal he cleaved through another layer of the astral world, And so now, Skull Knight possesses a weapon that's on par with Void's spatial abilities. He can already interpret the flow of causality pretty well thanks to spending all this time in the astral world, as we mentioned earlier. So in theory, Skull Knight now has the tools to finally take down his mortal enemies. But the question then becomes, can he pull it off? And we're not exactly sure. This is where our point about Skull Knight trying to jump Femto becomes relevant. Armed with a weapon that he specifically created to entrap the God Hand within the Abyss, Skull Knight had been on the lookout for an opportunity to use it ever since Slann came and went. Like we said a moment ago, that fight was his proof of concept that the Sword of Actuation works. Skull Knight had never used this blade that he'd been preparing for probably decades, if not centuries, before that point. And seeing it work the way it did must have given him some confidence. But it should also have come with a bit of foresight on his end, and this is where we think he kind of forgot who his enemies were. When Skull Knight showed up at the eclipse, he was wary of the fact that causality is 99.9% inevitable. He knew that if something was happening, Void had likely already seen it happen. But SK would charge ahead anyway because that's just how he is. Over time, he saw guts break out of the causal current like a boundless leaping fish, and he must have thought that he too could pull off something similar, being a fellow struggler himself. Skull Knight chose a moment in time he knew would be too crucial for a God Hand member to ignore, and he decided to gamble everything on that moment. Well, getting to these demonic angels usually requires a demonic ritual to take place. With Griffith's incarnation, SK now had a physical target available to him at all times. He decided that he would strike when Griffith's guard was likely to be at its lowest. That would be when he got directly involved in his war with Ganishka and left most of his war demons to deal with the Kushan Emperor's infernal pseudospawns. Griffith flew up to Ganishka's head in his Shiva form to personally dispatch of the delusional apostle, but just as he was about to touch one of his faces, Skull Knight jumped him. He used the Sword of Actuation to cut through space and materialize mere inches away from Femto. It was such a surprise that even the ever-vigilant Zod was caught off guard, and he was only there to act as his master's vehicle. Skull Knight must have thought this ambush tactic would work considering everything was accessible to him in the physical realm, but he forgot that the God Hand possesses the power of foresight. Even if they aren't completely omniscient, they're prescient enough to predict what will happen at an important temporal junction, and Skull Knight's assassination attempt was ordained by causality itself. When Femto caught the space-tearing sword slash of the Sword of Actuation and manipulated it to cut off Ganishka's head, he uttered words that sounded just like a prophecy. To paraphrase, he said that an apostle twice reincarnated and a sword stroke that reaches into the depths of the astral world has opened the door to a global interstice. Skull Knight tried to kill Femto, the youngest God Hand, and ended up triggering the great roar of the astral world. So what will happen when he goes up against Void again? As we've already established in this video, Void's interpretation of causality seems to be the most accurate of the lot. If Femto could anticipate Skull Knight's assassination attempt, then Void most certainly can, which makes it twice as difficult to get to him. Now, you might think it's not that important to kill Void in the first place, because isn't Griffith the antagonist of Berserk? But even from a narrative standpoint, Void is one of the most crucial pieces of the God Hand puzzle. He's the one who carries out the Invocation of Doom, branding individuals with an inescapable death. He's the one who leads every demonic ritual, with his kinsmen providing critical support. When Kentaro Miura was asked what was the key to understanding the God Hand's motives, he simply said, Void. And with Chapter 362 sending the Berserkverse into a frenzy of speculation over these guys' shared history, it would be a crime if Studio Gaga didn't finish Skull Knight and Void's story. Their rivalry is the blueprint of it all, so it's important that it gets resolved too. Every story usually ends with the good guys managing to overpower the bad guys in the end at a terrible cost, so the real query here is how will that happen? Skull Knight has already sacrificed his life, his love, his friends, his kingdom, everything, in order to defeat his enemy. With the Sword of Actuation, he has a chance to close this excruciating epilogue of his life. In order to get to Void, he will have to find a way to shroud his approach from causality's eye, and there's only a couple of vague ways we can see him doing this. For starters, let's just get this idea that if Void were simply caught off guard like Griffith, then Skull Knight could easily trap him within the Abyss. That's far too simple, and Void's main fighting abilities are basically the same as the Sword of Actuations. If Skull Knight sends a space-cutting sword strike towards Void, he can simply portal it away, unless the two clash and lead to an astral explosion of catastrophic proportions. What he will need to do is trick Void into thinking that his attack is a normal one, and then trap him with the sword. This is easier said than done for obvious reasons. The second path, and the one that we think is more likely to work, is if Skull Knight finds objects and/or people lying outside the purview of causality and has them carry out his job for him. When Skull Knight explains to Guts the nature of Griffith post-incarnation, he says it's as if he has become an author writing his own life story in real time. The only ones who can truly affect him and remain unaffected by him are those outside of his story. And we're sorry to say, Skull Knight isn't one of those people. Guts and Griffith's dynamic is a parallel to the one shared by Skull Knight and Void, which automatically pulls them into this twisted tale causality has fashioned for all of us. In order to change that, they'll need allies entirely unrelated to all this causal business, and that's where people like Rickert and Daiba come in. Rickert has accepted his life's truth and moved on from his days as a Falcon. That's why he was able to slap Griffith in Falconia when no one else could even touch him. Daiba has seemingly moved on from his service to Ganishka and is also one of the most knowledgeable people on all things astral. Like Skull Knight, he was able to reverse engineer the core concepts of a Behelit, but instead of creating a sword, he made a man-made Behelit to produce demonic soldiers for Ganishka's army. Daiba's knowledge of the astral world could easily be on par with, if not far above that of the great mages of Elfhelm. And now that all of them are gathered in one location, the crew can brainstorm a plan to hide their true intentions from their enemies. Flora was able to create a talisman that dulled the effects of the brand of sacrifice, something we thought was impossible when the series began. She hinted that things would have been even better had she the strength of her youth, which suggests to us that there's a way to actually circumvent the fate demons try to force upon you. The reason why we haven't already seen a mage take care of Griffith is because most of the current timeline mages are softer than pudding, and the ones that do know how to do that are old and well beyond fighting age. By gathering a retinue of unaffected soldiers, Skull Knight can lead a charge on the God Hand from some sort of causal blind spot, and this could become literal if the series finds a way to do this via spellcraft. And if it doesn't, there's always the last resort in any life or death situation for a soldier committed to a cause. If SK can't take Void out, he might try going out with him. Skull Knight can, at any point, just appear in front of Void, grab him, and let both of them fall into a pit created by the Sword of Actuation. Suicidal tactics aren't something we promote employing on this channel, but considering SK is already dead and doomed to hell, it might just work out for him. Of course, all of this is contingent on the idea that Skull Knight will be the winner. The evidence from round 1 and 2, both resounding successes for Void by the way, prove otherwise. It's just as likely, if not more likely, that Void gets Skull Knight instead and exacts his revenge across 2 lifetimes. That would be an L we'd be embarrassed to carry around with us even in heaven, but it's a real possibility given the powers Void has displayed in the series. On top of that, since no one has ever killed a God Hand member before, we don't know if they even can die. Skull Knight, on the other hand, has already died and seems to only be sticking around because of his bloody grudge against Void. Once that's resolved, we suspect he will dissolve into the astral world and finally be at peace for once. So it's a very tough one to call, as you can see, but we're gonna stick with Skull Knight for our answer, because we like rooting for the good guys here on Marvelous Anime, and we're pretty sure he was standing behind us as we were creating this video. Creepy bastard. Marvelous verdict! But speaking of that, this is about as far as we go. Skull Knight vs. Void is one of the more intriguing rivalries of Berserk, not just because of its foundational nature, but also because of its unpredictability. Skull Knight has taken 2 losses from Void personally, and every time he thinks of a new way to kill him, Void comes out 4 steps ahead of him. It's an unintentional game of cat and mouse in a way, only the scale is massive, the ramifications are dire, and the regulator is the literal concept of fate. We think it should be, and will likely be, Skull Knight who wins. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.